So good morning, afternoon, or good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. Today, we're very happy to welcome Professor Wayne Landis from the Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington University in the US. His current area of research is ecological risk assessment at large spatial and temporal scales. His research contributions have included the creation of the action at a distance hypothesis for landscape toxicology and the development of the relative risk model for multiple stressor and regional scale risk assessment. He wrote the textbook Introduction to Environmental Toxicology, has consulted for state, federal, and local governments, as well as industry. He was named a fellow of the Society for Risk Analysis and was recently named to the science panel for the Puget Sound Partnership. His talk today is on ecological risk assessment and decision-making in the era of climate change. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, Wayne, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for staying. And if you're hungry, go ahead and eat dinner. Yeah, I know how time is so funny. So this is just my lead-off slide. And you're going, well, what does that do with climate change? Well, the answer is, this is Skagit River. I'm going to talk about that in the second half of the talk. So climate change does lots of interesting things. And in something like a watershed, especially, we're almost at the 49th parallel, which isn't that far north for you guys, but in the States, that's as far as we can go in the lower 48. And what we're starting to see with the climate change is that we have the same amount of precipitation, but now it's coming more as rain and not as much as snow. And you're going, well, that's good. I said, no, we don't have large reservoirs in this part of the United States because the reservoirs are the snow on the mountains. And of course, when the summer comes and the snow starts melting, that's where we get our drinking water, among other things. Also the water for irrigation for the agriculture. Also the salmon runs are geared up to come in during many of them during the snow melt. So there's sufficient run and flow through the rivers. So just that little bit of a warming, altering the timing of the snowpack is going to have huge infrastructure issues, huge climate issues, huge habitat issues, and they're all rolled in. And this is my way of summarizing all that, along with being a picture of where I live. Where you have the Salmon River, which is exactly what we have here. You have the tall mountains, and we're right on the Puget Sound. So there's almost there's a huge slope from when you have deepest part of the Puget Sound's like 100, 150 meters. And here we have, 2,000 meter mountains, right? 6,000 feet mountains right here next to us. So it's having a noticeable change. And I guess we need to bring people from certain parts of the United States just to show that climate change is true still. So a working paradigm, how I think evolution is true. And you're going, of course it is. Remember, I live in the United States. Probability is the key, and even a lot of scientists, a lot of ecologists now still really have a challenge with that, and natural selection continues to work. So the past is really not a harbinger of a potential future. The world's a complex system, and what I mean by that is that it's dynamic, not in equilibrium, and the parts are interacting through differential equations or combinations of stochastic and differential interactions. So that idea of having an ideal state, or you're going to recover back to a previous condition, I'm sorry, you can't go home again. You're not even allowed to. It's not part of the system. So how are we going to deal with all these things far into the future? We're going to have to use adaptive management. We need tools, mathematical tools, thinking tools, in order to deal with that. And in this case, we need to build a paradigm that actually works for the field research, the other kinds of things that are going on, also planning societies that is adaptive and understands the reality of these ecological systems. I still find this is a challenge to many people. They always think that if you leave it alone, it will go back the way it used to be. I have a vested interest in that, where I live, where my house is actually used to be under a mile of ice during the last ice age before people came. And the only thing living here is probably ice worms. So I like it is now and don't want it to go back too far. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2011 Pellston workshop, and Yannicka was there. And I'm actually going to show Yannicka off just a little bit. I think I have your paper up as one of my examples from that workshop. And that was really the first time that Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry was really coming to grips with climate change. There are still many members who actually talked about climate variability as a thing, not meaning that there was actually a direction. The two studies I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to reverse the order for you guys, is the risk assessment for the Skagit River, and that was Eric Lawrence. We'll talk about that second, but there's another new paper coming out by Marion Keynes and Diane Hinchell that actually talks about Charleston, South Carolina, the increase in flood risk and risk to infrastructure due to climate change and increasing the height of the water. And then I'm going to talk briefly about our next CTAC Pellston workshop in Norway in 2022. Just one slide, just to let you guys know what we're up to. I just want to emphasize this. I know you had John Carragher give a talk to you guys. So John knows all this better than I do. He's really good at explaining this. And he has a good style about it. I define risk as the probability of effect on a specific endpoint, and an endpoint is something that people care about. And this is actually a definition I took from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine back in 2016. And ecological risk assessment is science for characterizing risk in ecological context. There are other kinds of risk assessments too, engineering risk assessment, human health, lots of other kinds of things. But to me, risk is always probability. And you can have risk meaning that it's a harmful effect or a beneficial effect. You can do either one. The calculation is the same. Causality, wow, I wish people would really focus on that. So much of the work I see in risk assessment is actually based on association. And of course, we know that correlation does not say causation. But when you talk about causality, a lot of times you have to bring in prior knowledge. And this is where I just go ahead and give it away, that Bayes is good, Bayes is true. And that prior knowledge really assists us in deciding what's causal. And then counterfactuals, I'll probably talk about those a little bit. Those are the what if questions within a framework to actually allow you to extend beyond your circumstance into new circumstances, new directions, and so forth. And one of the classic papers about that is Balke and Pearl 2011. And Judea Pearl just came out of the Book of Why, a couple of years ago, and just had really good cartoons about this. And I recommend it to my students. And it's actually funny for being an artificial intelligence book. Ecosystem services, we'll talk about that some. And Costanza's classic definition is benefits, the aspects of ecological structure that benefits human population derived directly or indirectly from ecosystem functions. And we know that. That's why our cities and so many of our industries are where they are, because of water, transportation, natural resources, and so forth. When I talk about it, I use the same definition really that the EPA used for it as an endpoint. It's an entity and the attributes of those entities. I don't use the old terminology of assessment and measurement endpoint. I think they're dated, and endpoint in toxicology and many other fields means the thing you measure from your experiment. That's not really what we're trying to get across when I talk about endpoint. And it is very anthropocentric. I understand that some people really push back on that. Said, well, who cares for the whales? I said, well, you do. Well, I know, but that's not a service. I said, it certainly is. So I come back and say, anything that you care about culturally, commercially, whatever, if people value it, then it can be considered as an endpoint. So that's a very broad range and allows us to make these calculations with a wide range of things that we can study. Back in 2011, the papers came out in 2013 But in 2011 is actually when we had a very nice meeting in Wisconsin. We sat around and we talked about climate change. Remember, this is very controversial, especially in the United States, but we had lots of people visiting from all over the world. And there's just a couple of papers. One is Yannicka, the team that she had was an overview of how it would affect populations and communities. So Yannicka, yours was really the ecology paper. And Mike Hooper's paper, who appeared right before yours, was really the molecular toxicology paper. So we were kind of moving along so that people would kind of see, oh, here's where climate change is going to affect the molecular biology. He said, yes. Populations, communities, yes, but in very specific ways. And I was the first author with 6 other amazing people looking at how it would affect how we think about ecological risk assessment. So that's kind of the history. I was looking back on this. I was excited and frustrated both. Excited that we'd gotten some stuff right, and frustrated that we'd not moved farther along. It's been challenging. And part of this is just a paper from years ago now by Will et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy. And it's just showing in the top bar that as far as we can tell, we are generating a whole series of novel climates, ones as far as we can tell have not existed before. So that's going to be a change. The climate where I live is certainly changing, and rapidly, into something that has not preceded it. Alaska, the tundra are undergoing huge changes. Mammoths are appearing out of the permafrost. All kinds of things are going on. Also, there are climates that are disappearing as well. So we're going to get new ones. We won't have the same climates we had before. And to just think that if it warms up, we're going to go back to what the climate was there the last time, the Eocene or whatever, where the temperatures were warm and so forth. No. Remember that ecological systems are complex systems. One of the characteristics of a complex system is that, in fact, they're historical. What happened in the past influences what happens now. So you don't get to go back. From this paper on the ecological risk assessment, we had 7 principles. And you're going, well, that's a kind of cool number, like the 7 samurai, and it comes up a lot. We had 7 people on the committee, so we each got a principle. That's how we did it, and each of us were responsible for writing one up. So that's where the 7 came from. The dynamics of climate change means that an ecological risk assessment has to include these features, and I would say not just an ecological risk assessment for climate change, but any ecological risk assessment for any period more than a couple of years. It's an ongoing driver that, when you look at historical data sets, has been in place since World War II, so the last 70 some years at least. And given current CO2 concentrations and where the economies of the world are going, it will continue and will probably accelerate into the future. So you don't get a buy anymore about considering climate change if you're managing landscapes for long times. So the analysis tools have to be appropriate. Again, nonlinear systems, stochastic aspects, and so forth. I see very few risk assessments actually doing that, and for lots of reasons. Whether you're in Europe, Australia, North America, the risk assessment paradigms that people use are now, they basically date back to the late 1990s. In science, I mean, that's like forever ago. And we just need to update a lot of these things. And it will take, there's a lot of inertia, and it's going to take a huge amount of work to change that. The 7 principles, consider the importance of global climate change. We'll go through these in a little bit. Assessment endpoints, old terminology, sorry, should be expressed as services. Responses can be positive or negative. The process requires a multiple stressor approach. And of course, all risk assessments should be doing that by now. And the responses are nonlinear. And this goes back to May and all those papers back in the 1970s. Determine the major drivers of uncertainty. I have a huge challenge explaining this to my students what uncertainty is. They always still think it's a feeling in their stomach when they're about to take a test, and they don't think they know all the answers. I know I don't know all the answers anymore, so I'm good with that. And I just say uncertainty is part of the math we do. Describe what it is we don't know and to map it out. And then to plan for adaptive management. This is kind of novel at the time. Adaptive management, what are you talking about? Well, a mining operation lasts at least 100 years in North America, from the initial discovery, the development, the mining, and then the closing. That's about a 100-year cycle, which now is going to be a very long time as opposed to the climate. And then, in many cases, the owners of the mine, of the land, have to put out a bond, and they're financially responsible for anything that happens to that site afterwards. So it's a very long-term management aspect. A large modern city, you're the ones that have long-lived cities compared to us, but you go in and to various cities and you see the church that was built in like 1010 AD, something like that. Really long-lived cities. So adaptive management is just going to have to be part of the management aspect. So we'll just go through, consider how important global climate change would be. It's important to understand how it will be to the risk assessment process and how to make a decision. And we just came up with this really simple diagram where predicted climate change, magnitude, rate, spatial, temporal extent, from small to large, are going to be there for 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. And also how much acreage, how much landscape you're going to use, what's the throughput going to be from small to large. And then what are the consequences? So if you have small and small, you're downhill like a local spill of gasoline, something that can evaporate, it's degradable, over a fairly small range, maybe not risk assessment, because you can probably clean that up in a few weeks. But CO2 in the atmosphere, large scale, large consequences, mining sites, large cities, managing the flow of rivers, those kinds of agriculture, those things are going to be long-term and at large scale. So essentially you have to deal with climate change as part of that planning process. I think people are now considering it, but it's going to be a challenge for it to become part of the normal paradigm in these kinds of situations. Endpoints should express ecosystem services. This is Glacier National Park, and I use that as an example. Glacier National Park used to be completely covered with glaciers, even in the summer, and they think now by 2030 there will be no glaciers in Glacier National Park. So that's one thing. People say, well, what do you care about parks? I said, I value mountain goats. And you walk up through here, there are mountain goats and sheep and all kinds of other things. And in this part of Montana, this is actually a clear economic importance for the ecotourism, conservation, recreation, all kinds of things. So this mountain goat, in my mind, is an important endpoint as it expresses very clearly a very important ecosystem service. And it's not clear what's going to happen to the wildlife there as that habitat becomes less and less alpine. Also, this is just down from where I live. This is the Skagit River. It's a floodplain. What they do here is they're huge in agricultural, especially tulips and daffodils. We just finished the tulip festival. The Skagit River is also the home to multiple Chinook salmon and other salmon runs. Again, it's a fishery, but also as a tourism. So this particular system provides large numbers of ecosystem services that are valued not just by the people from Europe, largely, and Asia, but also indigenous people. And in the United States, the indigenous people, the tribes, are sovereign, and they have treaties with the United States government. So they have a major say in this management process. The way they look at it is they plan for 7 generations into the future. And that tends to be longer than many of us think about. That's kind of the conservation aspect that they're looking for. You can have positive and negative things happen by climate change. I do enjoy the sunshine, but I am concerned about the lack of snow and the water supply. In some areas, the land is going to be more suitable for certain kinds of agriculture. But if you're in the southeastern United States, their forestry there is mostly the pine forests, very quickly growing longleaf pine, things like that. Under various climate change scenarios, that southeast part of the United States can become more and more grassland. Again, you're going to take away a very huge ecosystem service that's been there since the time of the initial colonization from Europeans. That's going to change a lot of the landscape, the kind of agriculture that's produced, how you're going to manage the national parks and so forth down there. So you're going to have positive and negative alterations. The other thing is it's going to require multiple stressor framework. And I just put this up. This is the one I use. Some of you are very familiar with it, where you have sources of stressors, the locations where things are, a variety of effects from many sources, many stressors, and a whole series of impacts. And this is the framework I'm going to be talking about in the examples I'll have later and be showing to you. This has been around, I think the first time we drew it, it was 1997. And it's fun to see other people use it. I just wish they'd cite it when they did. But that's actually a positive thing. A friend of mine told me that. It's very positive, Wayne. Now they just take it for granted. So I guess that's good. Doesn't help my impact factor sometimes, but that's okay. And this is what it looks like when you write it all out. We have sources, so forth and so on. And this was with one of my students, Laura Gaslin-Tatro. She was looking at mercury, global climate change in the South River that we'd worked on a lot. And we have down here in red where climate change and the aspects of climate change or affect this site would be. And these are all the things that would be affected by the climate change. And this is up in the very western part of our state of Virginia. So it's at some altitude, very old mountains, the Appalachians, and just small changes in temperature, precipitation, and so forth. It's going to change the habitats and so forth in this area. We'll talk about the difficulties in trying to predict and calculate this, the extent, in a little bit. Develop cause and effect diagrams that think about management decisions. A lot of people call these conceptual models, and I do as well. These cause and effect diagrams are conceptual models, but they're not supposed to be cartoons. Not here, let me pass my Forestry 101 test or my Oceanography 101 when you put in all the food webs and things like that. We actually need to be able to write diagrams from that. And when you start writing those cause and effect diagrams, you're in fact drawing equations out. You're planning for the mathematical transformations. I try to get my students and everyone else to start thinking about how I'm going to write the equation very early on. It's not just a cartoon to show people you know what species live there, but to actually put in those functions. We also need to think about time. How should I put this? Not everyone really likes calculus that much, but I think it's really useful. And there's other ways of dealing with time as well. 6, determine the major drivers of the uncertainty. Find out how is this going to work. This is where Monte Carlo tools work in really well. The sensitivity analysis, which variables are really important in driving the system. Bayesian networks do that. People keep telling me they don't deal well with time. And then I'll show you some examples where in fact they do. You need to think about the conditional probability nodes and so forth. And entropy is a measure in a Bayesian network time situation of mutual information, how much information these two variables have to contribute to the third. And then you might actually have to go to the field and think differently. So you reduce the uncertainty by actually going out, getting additional information, maybe perhaps using a different modeling tool and reducing the uncertainty so that decision makers can make those decisions. The challenge is that many decision makers say they want certainty, and I keep telling them, I'm sorry, that's not available. It's and also precautionary principle, which is used a lot in parts of the world, and ours, which is not so precautionary in the States. they're just talking about different amounts of uncertainty is essentially what they're doing. And I have to sit and explain that to them. Plan for adaptive management. The future is going to be different. It will be different, and you'll have to plan for that. Oh, and math is useful. Having a structure is useful to start deciding what's important and when. So those are the 7 principles. Unfortunately, a lot of people seem to have read this paper. Implementation's been more of a challenge. And I appreciate being asked to come and talk about this. Maybe we can get some of that implementation underway. This is a really fun book. Taleb definitely has some points. Of course, this is the black swan, that highly improbable events will occur and they will have large consequences. And here I am giving another international lecture from a small desk in my study. This is not like the new norm. I think this is my 7th one since this year. This is not what we were thinking about 2 years ago. It's had huge consequences. So this is a major black swan. I wish more people had thought about this, and we'll have similar things occur into the future. So yes, we need to plan and be resilient when things change. Adaptive management is going to be essential. And this is my representation of how to think about adaptive management, where the part in the middle here, I call it the loop. This is actually called an ODA loop, an observe, you observe something, you put it in a context, you make a decision, you see how it works. That's essentially what this is. And ecological risk assessment is a mathematical and decision-making structure for doing that. And you have the process that we're mostly involved in. We have lots of societal constraints. We always want more money and better graduate students. Sorry, guys. We always want great graduate students. It's like a rule. And you guys probably say, and I need better faculty. I agree. So we have the societal constraints, also the histories of the places. One of the fun things about going through Europe is that history does count, and you don't have to sit on an airplane for hours to see it. You just have to get on the train. It's really, really neat to see. And then lots of other externalities, like change in environmental conditions, climate change, population growth, new technologies. These things are all influencing it as well. So it's not just climate change, but it's all these other kinds of constraints, changes, technology, economies, and so on, that are taking place that we need to consider as part of the long-term adaptive management process. And this is just the loop. And of course, I had to put the ecological risk assessment part in the red. In many ways, I think this is the goal of us teaching and having programs in ecological risk assessment. So we actually have the mathematical and thinking structure, the paradigm, to actually start doing this in an operational fashion, and not what I consider kind of a, oh, let's make it up as we go along. I think it's much better to have a process in place. One thing that we may have forgotten, and from those 7, and this is the idea of communication. Communication is enormously difficult, and COVID-19, while the science was very clear, our communication about it was not as strong as it should have been, and the consequences have been huge. And you compare what's happened in much of Europe and in North America compared to Australia, where they have less than 1,000 deaths due to COVID since the outbreak of the pandemic. And a lot of that they attribute to communication about health, communication about risk, also trust in their government, those kinds of things. So I think the risk communication is going to be enormously important going forward. And some of the things I bring up is that, no, you don't get to have reference sites. Those things don't really exist, except as a social construct. These systems are dynamic. Baselines, people always say, well, we want to use the baseline of what it was like in 1972. Well, 1972 had major impacts as well. So you just can't think of a baseline like it's an equilibrium system. Non-contaminant changes in structure, ecological structures. Everything's not chemicals. Landscape changes, a number of people. So there are a lot of things that are not chemically correlated. Social changes, all those kinds of things. And everything has multiple stressors, multiple agents. And when I use stressor, I'm not really trying to put a positive and negative on it. It's just old terminology from risk. But multiple agents of change, and we need to consider those. And there are sometimes we cannot consider them. We don't have the data, or they're unknowns. We still have to understand that those do exist. Now, how do you communicate the stakeholders and managers? That's an ongoing discussion, and we need to get better at it. This is one of the papers that is very recent. And this is actually the first Mariana Keynes and Diane Hinchell paper came out in 2019. But the other one, Parameterization Framework for Quantitative Approach for Integrated Risk and Resilience Assessments, that's part of the Bayesian Network series that Janneke was one of the editors on. So this is a very different way. It's not really talking about chemicals. Or the traditional topics of risk assessment, even though they are involved. But this is their development of a community-based structure for risk assessment. And when they mean community, they've done a great job in involving the community of Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina is one of the oldest European cities in North America, especially in what's now the United States. It's right along the coast. It's where the cotton was shipped out from the Confederacy during the Civil War. Other things were shipped in. It's had the British invade it, the Yankees invade it, and it's now a major industrial development center in that part of the country. Boeing builds airplanes here. BMW builds cars here. It's really undergoing lots of transformations. And as the climate's changing and the sea level is rising, they're now getting an increase in flooding events and an increase in hurricanes. So those are the kinds of things that are going on. And what these papers do is to invoke a framework, parts of which I just showed you. If you notice right here, they have sources, stressors, habitats, location, effects, and impacts. Yay! But what they do instead is, in order to talk about resilience, they're talking about the things that you can change, the controlling factors in all of this, the things you can do to make it more resilient, the things you can put in place that when something changes, you can control it. So this is just their diagram where you have stressor controls and different technologies and social constructs in order to do this, and just some other examples. So what Keynes and Hinchell have done is actually said, here's the risk part, but now how do we manage that risk? How do we manage things in an adaptive management framework? And this is how they actually write equations for resilience. So this, the control factor and what it can do, is now part of that pathway talking about risk and the controlling factors. This has been my problem with people saying resilience for years. Show me the equation for that. And when you can show me the equation, you know what you're talking about. This paper has been writing the equations for resilience and managing resilience. This is much more traditional engineering way of thinking about it, which I accept. So these papers are really good reads. Here's this should look familiar to you guys. This is a Bayesian network for doing exactly that. So this is the Bayesian network from the Keynes et al. Paper in 2021. So you do the parameterization. The rest of it's very familiar to what we're used to as risk assessors using Bayesian networks. So here you go. You can go through and start doing the calculations. This is not what my research is, but this just came out, and I wanted to make sure that those 7 principles can be implemented. Now, we're going to change this into my case study. And it's not really my case study, it's Eric Lawrence's case study. It was his master's thesis. We are in the process now of rewriting it for publication. And those of you who do a thesis, and master's is a very short program, so usually our students publish right after, they start getting the publication ready for right after we're done. And he defended it in the late fall of last year. Our objectives was to think about how we're going to incorporate climate change into a very traditional risk assessment in some ways. The risk assessment is dealing with pesticides in the agricultural region, and our endpoint is Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon are culturally valuable for so many reasons, which I went into later. where we talk about how important climate and chemical stressors are and what their relative importance is in a fairly straightforward formulation. And through this, we're built a tool to serve as an adaptive management tool, where it would plug into that loop where the risk, where the ecosystem, where the ecological risk assessment is. Those were our objectives as we went into the study. And climate change, you guys are familiar with that. Ice and snow melt are the issues for us. We are having sea level rise. That doesn't mean that islands are getting covered up. We have islands out in Puget Sound that are actually rising. Parts of our land are still rebounding from the last glacial period. We also, ocean acidification is a huge issue where we are, and we're having different storms, different temperatures. Climate change and risk. Climate change is going to affect the exposure, the uptake, the chemicals, and this goes back to Pamela Noy's paper back in 2009. And then the Hooper paper from that same series, we have climate-induced sensitivity to chemicals, and also the chemicals can induce sensitivity to changes in climate. And this is just the diagram where the precipitation temperature and the pathways and how we thought about them as we're putting them into the model. So this is our attempt to actually have something we can demonstrate how you think about climate change in one of our very studied areas here in the Northwest. One of the issues we're running into for the workshop that we're planning for 2022 are global climate change models. So many of the global climate change models are actually designed for the world. And we need to have accurate temperatures and changes in precipitation for relatively small regions, like a watershed, like a catchment. So there's issues with the downscaling. In this particular case, Eric spent a lot of time working with various people on using the climate change models for that downscaling aspect. And these are the versions of the models and so forth that Eric used to actually do the downscaling. Turns out there were 12 models that were downscaled to fit our particular area. The models change in exactness, not in exactness, in where the prediction is, but they did not change. They're very similar in pattern. So whenever we're talking about uncertainty for the changes in temperature and so forth, in this study, we're going to focus on temperature. That's where that variation, that's where the uncertainty calculations were, is when you compare those different models. I was right here when I took the picture, the first slide in this. This is just the largest watershed in our region. It's well studied for this area. Lots of other things were going on. Right there it was. Provides habitat for many organisms. It's an iconic, huge agricultural area. So this is a very highly valued region, Washington State, by both Native people and the Europeans. Chinook salmon are very valuable for a number of reasons. It's actually controlled by our Endangered Species Act. It's what's called an ecologically significant unit. And the Puget Sound Partnership, our state agency, has set up a goal of no net loss of Chinook salmon in our region. We're not doing well with meeting that. We break the Skagit River into different regions. Most of our research is going to talk about the ones that are downstream because people fail to measure things upstream. There's some access, but I think it's just, this is where the agriculture and so forth is the one over to the west. And it's just challenging. The area up in here, this is actually Canada, right along the border. So our study is mostly focused in the last 20 kilometers or so. The relative risk model, just draw it a little different. You have sources, stressors, habitats, and so on. You've seen this before. I think it's on all our papers now. And when we try to take it out, people ask us, the reviewers ask us to put it back in, okay? So it's just a framework, multiple stressors, habitats are the spatial component, and we try really hard to describe cause and effect. So this is Eric's conceptual model. The red are the toxicological pathways. The blue are the climate change, the environmental pathways. And you have the effects through this region. And we're just looking at the one endpoint because Chinook salmon are well understood. We have really well understood population models for that, and that we use and actually do these calculations out until the next 100 years or so. This is what it looks like for real. The blue and the purple are, the blue over here are the climate change aspects. Here's the toxicology. Here are the effects. And we actually use a Leslie matrix parameterized specifically for Chinook populations in the northwestern part of the United States for this. It's actually the model that NOAA uses in order to do this. So here we have the population size. And of course, our endpoint is what's the probability of having net loss or not. So this is the population output as far as size. And this is what our probability of having no net loss. We have simulation year here. So this goes out to year 20 and then year 50. We ran it for longer, but after 50, the model starts having issues as well. So we have our specification nodes, climate, Chinook, toxicity nodes. And the more things you put in there, the more pathways that you would put into the model. Climate change, accessed through the USGS Geo Data Portal. USGS is wonderful to work with. For the future, we use various different kinds of models in order to do the calculations. And it just shows you what the variability is in the historical projections. And the error terms are also incorporated into these nodes as well. Going from air temperature is what we are estimating to water temperature. Eric actually used a simple regression for that. Turns out there are no good models for where we are from translating air temperature into water temperature for the salmonids, which is a little surprising. We have lots of DO sample sites, dissolved oxygen sample sites, which we put into it in our region. But we don't have so many for toxicity. These are the tox nodes, and the amounts of organophosphates and other kinds of agricultural chemicals are measured, but just in this more downstream part of our study area. Here's the toxicity pathway. We actually use chemical concentrations of the chlorpyrifos, and we actually have a toxic units way of adding them together. We actually know they're synergistic, and this is the work of Kathy Letts et al. At NOAA. So we use the toxic units, but we control and add in that synergism to estimate acetylcholinesterase activity or the reduction of it. We get mortality and change in swimming rates, and from that we extrapolate what the toxicological effects would be, and eventually the ecological effects. So here we use this method called peg the corners that John may have talked about. Here we have dose response equations, and for much of this we're using a machine learning data set to combine the two into this acetylcholinesterase activity. We use dose response curves, but notice we have different dose response curves than some people. The gray is the confidence interval. That's what most people are familiar with. The outer lines are actually the predictive interval. If you have this regression with this amount of variation, this is where you expect data to be. And remember, we care about the data, not just the central tendency. We have found this is a better way to think about uncertainty in the measurement and so forth than just using a traditional confidence interval. This is done with the DRC package, and it's all calculated in R. Population nodes, adult reduction. Anyone who does population biology will go, oh yeah, reduction in survival, egg to emergence, juvenile water quality to get those effects, and we calculate the population size from that. This is a well parameterized model for this region. We use a program called RAMUS to do it, but you can do it in almost any kind of modeling format that uses matrices. We start off with 500,000 starting population. Very few of those are adults, and the ones that we're showing you are mostly a 20-year output. So when you go into the risk regions and you look at the risk, so here we have historical risk, what it is now, that with climate change, and we have the risk due to climate change. Notice what happens to increase in risk due to climate change. In the summer, In risk region 1, that's the one way downstream, you have a small change in risk over the 20-year period. And the fall, not so much. And I'll get to the reason in just a minute. And in the spring, somewhat there too. Then the question ended up becoming, well, what's going on here? Again, in region 2, which is just upstream from that, an increase in risk here and here. This is being driven by habitat. It's being driven by the increase in temperature and the lowering of the dissolved oxygen. When we go through and actually look at this, we find that the chemicals have very little effect. Remember I talked about risk can be in both directions, positive and negative. Down here as it warms up in the upper parts of the watershed, it's actually more often to be in the optimal temperature for the Chinook salmon. So you see, even within one watershed, you have the downstream parts being at a higher risk than some of the other aspects of it. And these are just the numbers, historical, future, and a percent change in these two regions. So the increase in risk is increasing the probability of Chinook population decline. And that's all already substantial. Look at these probabilities of the decline, and we're just adding to it. And if you're familiar with populations, those kinds of smaller changes can create bigger changes pretty quickly. We do the entropy analysis. What factors are driving this? It's DO and water temperature are the major drivers. Toxic effects, not so much. Toxic effects were important because we often don't have data. When you don't have data, that has a big influence on the model. And when we do, the toxicology is often in very low numbers. And even when there are toxic effects, it's swamped by the habitat effects. From here, we can actually do the counterfactuals, go from changes in water temperature to changes in Chinook population size. However, with the Bayesian networks, you can actually set what would you have to do to the environment to have 100% probability of not losing the fish. And you'll see how you have to change the distribution of water temperature, DO, and toxicology. They are not huge effects, are they? It will take a lot of work to accomplish those things, but you're basically changing the input distributions to get protection of the Chinook population size. This is a counterfactual that's really straightforward to calculate and are things I rarely see calculated. Key findings: the risk Chinook salmon and the sensitivity of stressors were dependent on region and season. An increase in temperature did influence the risk, and the influence of climate change was relatively small, but the risk is already high. And so you're changing things a few percentage points. But with something as valuable as Chinook salmon, what you're basically doing is just increasing the rate in which you're going to lose those populations. Temperature dissolved oxygen will really be more important. And recent ongoing effects in Chinook recovery in the Skagit River are really focused on habit restoration, which is not a bad thing. Yet you have to be careful about is changing the correct habitat to get the correct temperature and DO regime, and to ensure also, one of the reasons that pesticides are not so important is right now where they're being used is not perhaps the best habitat. If you end up restoring habitat, but then that agricultural input is still there, you're going to be working at cross purposes. And next steps, we'll see where this takes us, Yannicka, next year. And Glacier National Park and without glaciers. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience.